I opened my mailbox and felt my stomach drop. She paraded around with her dog, bragging I'd be forced to tear it all down. But the city inspector didn't find me. He fined her right in front of everyone. And that was just the beginning. I set my suitcase down on the porch and froze. A bright yellow paper flapped against the doorframe corners, curling in the humid Virginia air. Notice of violation was printed in block letters, and underneath the bold command, "Remove non-compliant fence immediately." I hadn't even unlocked my door yet. 1 week away, visiting my sister in Knoxville, and my first welcome back was a demand taped to the paint I'd touched up just last spring. My stomach tightened, not from travel fatigue, but from the sting of being told I'd broken a rule I didn't even know existed. Across the street, Glenda Lancaster stood with her tiny terrier leash looped delicately around her wrist. She raised her hand in a slow, staged wave, the kind politicians give when cameras are on them. Her lips curved, but it wasn't warmth. It was the kind of smile you give when you've waited months for a trap to spring shut. Behind her, the air smelled of charcoal and sizzling ribs. The neighbor 2 houses down had his sprinkler-going water ticking across the lawn like a metronome. It should have felt like any other summer evening in Bramble Ridge, suburban peace kids on bikes, burgers smoking, but my world tilted with that paper. Back already, Greg Harlan called from his driveway. He leaned against his mailbox, arms crossed, the kind of posture that said he'd seen this play out before. Greg was retired Navy, gruff but fair. He jerked his chin toward the yellow sheet. "She's been gunning for you. Don't act surprised." I tugged the notice free. The glue stuck, leaving a faint mark on the trim. My name was typed correctly, my address precise. The form language was cold, non-compliant structure observed. Immediate removal required. Fine schedule will commence after 10 days. 10 days. Inside. I dropped the suitcase by the stairs and went straight for the file cabinet in my office. My hands remembered the rhythm bottom drawer, third folder. The smell of manila folders and old toner rose as I pulled out a sheet fence installation approval, March 2009. The HOA's stamped signature sat at the bottom in faded blue ink. I had followed every step. I'd even kept the receipt for the lumber tucked behind it like a badge of honor. The fence wasn't just lumber and nails. My father had stood with me that spring, steadying posts while I mixed cement. He'd passed 3 years later, but every time I walked the line of that fence, I felt his presence in the grain of the cedar. That evening, I stepped out to the yard and laid my palm against the nearest post. The wood felt warm, sun-soaked, alive, solid, prop intact. From my porch, Glenda's laugh drifted sharp as glass. She was still outside, chatting with another board member, eyes darting toward me like a hawk checking on its prey. My pulse quickened. I sat at the desk, unfolded the notice, and read every word again. Something caught my eye near the bottom pursuant to Amended Bylaw Section 4.3. Amended, I flipped through my binder of covenants. The bylaws I had were dated 2014. Section 4.3 back then had nothing to do with fences, it was about trash bins. The edges of the yellow paper trembled between my fingers. I checked my email, scrolling through the HOA folder. No notice of amendment, no vote, no record. When had this changed? They couldn't just rewrite rules behind closed doors. Could they? Greg ambled closer, voice low enough that only I could hear. Word is, they slipped in new restrictions last quarter. No proper ballot, just a board decision. You're not the first, Len, but you might be the loudest case. His jaw tightened. She wants that fence down because it blocks her sightline. Nothing more noble than that. I wanted to laugh, but my throat caught. Property and dignity both under attack. My home was supposed to be where I could breathe easy after decades of spreadsheets and claim disputes. Now it was a battlefield dressed in barbecue smoke and hydrangea bushes. The sprinkler shut off with a hiss, leaving the air too quiet. I turned back inside, scanning the inbox again. A new message blinked at the top, time-stamped just minutes ago. Subject line, fence, violation, bracket. I clicked. The HOA board had sent a group email, all caps in the header. Brackets, fence, is a violation removal scheduled. The CC line stretched half a dozen names, neighbors I waved to each morning. My chair creaked as I leaned back, heart pounding louder than the cicadas outside. The post I'd touched minutes ago stood firm, but the email made it feel as if the ground beneath it had already begun to erode. And in Glenda's smirk across the street, I saw the promise this was only the opening shot. By morning, the neighborhood had shrunk into itself. Garage doors opened and closed without the usual waves. I rolled my trash can to the curb and caught two silhouettes across the street pause mid-conversation. Their eyes slid to me then, away like I was something you shouldn't stare at directly. My phone buzzed against my palm. Greg had forwarded a screenshot from the HOA group chat. At the top, Glenda's name sat in a neat blue bubble emergency correction clause immediate compliance. Another message a beat later, President's aesthetic authority applies when standards are threatened. The thread piled up with thumbs-ups and a few cautious understood. Emergency correction. I mouthed the words as if they'd taste like something other than rubber and bile. I set the trash can down and crossed the sidewalk toward Glenda's place. Her terrier yapped once, then quieted when she lifted a finger. She wore a pale sweater over her shoulders despite the warm fall morning, pearls shining in the sun like punctuation marks. She saw me coming and squared herself with that serene, church lady smile. "Good morning, Leonard," she said as if we were discussing azaleas. "I trust you saw the messages." I saw them. I stopped with a polite gap between us two neighbors on a brochure. There's no such clause in our bylaws. And there's no vote. She tilted her head. The board has discretion for emergency aesthetic corrections. It's in the president's purview when a property's appearance degrades community value. Each syllable came out pressed and ironed. Aesthetic authority, I repeated. I must have missed that chapter. My voice tried to stay level the way I used to keep it with angry policyholders. I have written approval for my fence. I brought it to you once. March 2009. Stamped and signed. A decade is a long time, she said lightly. Standards evolve. Taste evolves. She eyed the fence behind me as if it were an old relative who shouldn't be driving anymore. And frankly, Leonard, it's not just the fence. It's the impression. A car eased down the street. In the reflection of its window, I saw two neighbors slow-walking their lab, listening. One of them gave me a small, apologetic grimace. The other lowered his gaze and fussed with the dog's collar. "My impression," I said, "is that you changed the rules and forgot to tell anyone." Glenda smiled again, deeper now. "We'll keep things civil, please. If you have documentation, you can submit it through the portal." She lifted her phone and tapped once. "Meanwhile, for everyone's peace of mind, we'll proceed." "Proceed what?" "With correction." The word landed like a gavel. I felt heat rising, the kind that starts at the collar and unbuttons your patience one hole at a time. You don't have the authority. She gave me a gracious half-bow that wasn't gracious at all. "I do." I went back to my garage because I knew if I stayed another minute my mouth would leave me before I did. The fluorescent lights stuttered to life with a faint hum. Stacks of file boxes lined the wall, the remains of 3 decades as a claims adjuster, the habit of saving every paper with a date and a signature. I pulled a milk crate to the workbench and started building a case the way you build a fire, kindling first, then something that will really catch. Approval, letter, front and center. Photos of the fence when we set the posts, and when we stained the panels with my father's old brush, the one with tape around the handle. I printed the HOA thread Greg sent and drew a box around emergency correction clause. Underneath, I wrote the date and time in block letters. The garage smelled like cardboard and oil and cedar dust that never quite leaves. It steadied me. The phone buzzed again, another neighbor, a name I recognized but rarely spoke to. "Sorry about all this. We're just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. The kind of message you send when you want to be two people at once." I typed back, "Me too." Then I deleted it and put the phone face down. By late morning, I had a packet thick enough to require a binder clip. I took a breath, wiped the dust from the approval letter's plastic sleeve, and walked it back out front. Glenda was still in her yard pruning a rosebush that didn't need pruning. The terrier watched me like a bailiff. "I'm submitting documentation," I said, holding the packet so she could see the stamped page on top. "Bylaw change requires notice and a vote. We didn't get either." She glanced at the top page and then made a small shooing motion with her fingers as if I'd brought a flyer for gutter cleaning. "Upload it, Leonard. The process matters. So does the truth." She leaned in, voice soft enough that only I could hear. "Then I suggest you get comfortable with it." A screen door squeaked behind me. The couple with the lab had stopped at their mailbox. The man nodded at Glenda like she was a notary public issuing certificates. The woman gave me another sorry smile and tugged the leash. I turned away before any more could leak out of me and went to my mailbox to check for something, anything that resembled fairness. The metal door clanged open. Inside was a plain envelope with the HOA letterhead. No stamp. Someone had hand-delivered it. I slid the paper free with my thumb. Notice of violation. Second notice. The fine had doubled. Due within 10 days or penalties escalate. For a second, I saw two pieces of paper, the one in my hand and the yellow one from the door, layered like tracing sheets over my life. Behind them, the fence lines receded into focus, each post we set, each panel we fitted to lay flush with the grade. My father had said fences were honest, they told you exactly where you stood. Now, I wasn't so sure. The fluorescent hum from the garage spilled into the driveway as I stood there, the letter a bright rectangle against the morning. My anger didn't come as a shout. It came as a clarity like turning a lens until the edges snap sharp. I folded the notice carefully and slid it into the packet. If they wanted process, I would give them the purest, coldest version of it they'd ever seen. Footsteps approached. Greg's shadow reached me before he did. "She's moving fast," he said without preamble. "Heard something on my walk. She called a guy big pickup company logo I didn't catch. Told him she needed a crew to deal with that fence by next week." I looked at the silver flag on the mailbox vibrating in the breeze. Deal with it how Greg's mouth tightened, however it takes. The terrier barked once across the street. Somewhere a screen door slammed. A lawnmower coughed awake at the far end of the block. I slipped the second notice into the binder clip and felt the edge bite my thumb, a small bright pain that proved I was still here. "Then I guess I'd better be ready when they show up," I said. By January, the cold had settled into the subdivision, a thin, persistent chill that made the vinyl siding creak at night. I drove to the last cul-de-sac on the map where the houses tapered off into a line of winter-bare trees and parked in front of a modest brick ranch with a crooked mailbox flag. Maria DuPont was painted in small white letters on the curb. Greg had sworn she once beat the HOA. "She knows their tricks," he'd said, leaning over my fence line like we were swapping fishing stories. "If there's a way through, she'll find it." Maria answered on the second knock. She was shorter than I expected, with clear eyes and a scarf looped twice against the cold. "Leonard Brackett," she said as if reading it off a docket. "Come in before we freeze your case shut." Her home office smelled like old books and lemon oil. A banker's lamp stained everything a patient yellow. The desk was a battlefield of sticky notes, yellow pads, binder clips, and 3 fat binders with city code embossed in flaking gold. On top of a stack sat a small square of paper in neat cursive. "Time your reveal." I sat in the wooden chair opposite her and slid my packet forward. The approval letter photographs, the 2 violation notices, and a printed screenshot of the HOA chat with Glenda's emergency correction clause boxed in red pen. Maria adjusted her glasses and read without speaking. The only sounds were the clock's second hand and a faint tap-tap from her pen against the desk. At the chat screenshot, she snorted quietly, but not kindly. "They fabricated a clause," she said at last, setting the pages down. "Or rather, your president did, and she's counting on neighbors not to know the difference between a clause and a rumor. She says she has aesthetic authority. She has aesthetic opinions," Maria said. "Authority is a different species." Tap, tap. "What you have," she lifted the approval letter between 2 fingers, "is a paper spine. Keep it straight." I exhaled. "They doubled the fine." "They'll triple it if you blink," she replied. "So don't. Now procedures. You need to save every email, not just the content, the headers, PDFs with timestamps. Print and date stamp the physical notices. Photograph the fence wide shots and close-ups of each post base. If anyone touches it, you'll want before and after in a grid like an insurance adjuster would do." "I can manage that," I said, and she raised an eyebrow until I added, "I did 30 years of claims." "Then you're fluent," she said, and for the first time a corner of her mouth softened. She reached behind her to a shelf and pulled out a thick blue binder tabs sprouting like hedgehog quills. Richmond City Ordinances. She flipped with the precision of a card dealer and slid the binder to me, a page already flagged with a pink tab. A neon highlighter had traced a paragraph. In the margin, her block letters, "No removal without permit." I read aloud, quietly, "Uniform fences shall not be materially altered or removed without a city-issued permit. Enforcement actions shall follow public notice and hearing as prescribed." My fingers settled on the underlined sentence like it might burn through the paper into my skin. So, all this talk about an emergency correction is not an emergency, and it's not a correction, Maria said. It's a bully wearing a clipboard. City code outranks HOA preferences. If they want your fence gone, they need a permit and a hearing transcript with your name spelled right. I thought of Glenda's pearls, her terrier, the way she had said correction as if it were a sacrament. Maria turned a fresh yellow pad and drew 3 boxes in a row. Evidence. Timing. Audience, she said, labeling each. You have the first. The second means we don't swing until their paperwork is crooked enough that even their friends see it. The third, she tapped the last box, is who needs to witness the swing, neighbor's treasurer. Perhaps a city inspector if we're lucky. Lucky paper trails attract professionals, Maria said. If Glenda keeps manufacturing rules, someone with a county seal will sniff it out. When that happens, we make sure your file is so clean, it squeaks. The radiator clanked in the hallway, then quieted. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering on cold asphalt. Photograph each post, I asked. Have to be sure, have to hear the steadiness in my own voice. Each post and each connection, she said. And take a picture of your mailbox with the second notice before you remove it. Date in frame. If you can print your emails with the full internet headers, yes, people still do that. She slid a stapler toward me like a judge handing down a sentence. Also, Leonard. I looked up. She tapped the sticky note with one finger. Time your reveal. I glanced around her office again at the law books, at framed photos on the wall, Maria shaking hands with a woman in a graduation gown. Maria in front of a river with men holding clipboards. You've done this before. I've done parts of it 100 times, she said. Most fights like these are about patience. Not righteousness, not volume. Patience and the right fact at the right hour. What's the right hour when they can't pretend not to see? She reached into the side drawer, pulled out a cheap point-and-shoot camera, and set it beside my packet. Phone photos are fine, but a camera with EXIF data is better. Belt and suspenders. I smiled without meaning to. My father would have liked you. He believed in extra nails. Then, honor him with good measurements, she said. Go home. Photograph, print, date, and breathe. Every bully's confidence is a rope. They keep pulling it, and eventually it's long enough to make a noose around their argument. She paused, then added, Not their neck. We're civilized. We were quiet for a beat, both of us listening to the clock. I realized I wasn't clenching my jaw anymore. What about contacting the city now? I asked. Preemptively. Too early, Maria said. Let them demonstrate the flaw. A complaint filed too soon looks like a feud. Filed with evidence after a false claim and a doubled fine, it looks like civic duty. And if they bring a contractor, you record. Stay on your property. No shouting, no colorful language for the minutes. She slid the ordinance binder back to herself, copied the page, and handed me the photocopy with her notes. If a saw touches that fence without a permit, the photographs will do more work than your voice ever could. I tucked the copy into my packet. The paper made a crisp sound, like something sealing shut. Inside my chest, a small door I hadn't noticed began to open. I stood, thanked her, and reached for the sticky note, then thought better of it. Leave it, Maria said. I'll make you another. She wrote the words again. Time your reveal, and press the note onto my packet. Her pen tapped twice. One more thing, she said as I reached the door. When the moment comes, don't strike until their paperwork can't be denied. Out in the cold, the sky was a pale metal lid. I sat in the car a minute, watching my breath fog the windshield, and ran my thumb along the edge of the ordinance copy. For the first time in months, I felt something besides anger settle in. It wasn't victory, it was direction. I started the engine, turned the heater up, and drove home to measure posts. The folding chairs squeaked as neighbors shifted knees, knocking together in the cramped clubhouse. The air smelled of stale coffee left too long on a burner, the fluorescent light above us buzzing like a wasp. At the front, Glenda stood beside a projector screen, remote in hand. Her pearls caught the light as the first slide appeared, a wide shot of my backyard fence. A bright red X stretched across the image. This is the non-compliant structure, she said, voice clear and satisfied. The next slide zoomed closer, each post magnified like evidence in a trial. I gripped my folder until the edges bent. Greg leaned forward 2 chairs down, whispering under his breath. Show them the letter. My pulse thumped against my ears. I stood, unfolded the document, and raised it so the board could see. Approval granted August 2010. Signed by then-President Harold Ames. Section 5.3 Fence Uniformity met. This is stamped. The notary's mark glistened faintly under the fluorescence. This fence was authorized. Glenda's smile didn't falter. That letter was voided when Emergency Correction Authority was adopted. She tapped her remote. On screen, a slide with the words Emergency Clause, Immediate Compliance typed in bold. The board has the discretion to override past approvals. I looked at Maria seated quietly near the back. Her eyes met mine, then flicked down toward the binder resting on her lap. Just enough of the ordinance tab was visible to remind me no removal without permit. But she didn't speak, and neither did anyone else. Mark Ellison, the treasurer, shifted in his seat. His pen clicked open, closed open. He raised it halfway, then set it down again. His lips pressed together as though words were lining up but refused to march. Around the room, neighbors leaned to one another. Murmurs. A woman near the coffee urn frowned. A man beside her shook his head. Yet no one rose. No one spoke over Glenda. Authority clung to her voice like static. She snapped her fingers and two men wheeled in a dolly stacked with tool bags. Contractors, calloused hands, steel-toed boots, eyes already on the slideshow. They didn't need her permission to act. They were measuring tape and power drills waiting for a nod. The room tightened. My throat felt dry as chalk. "You don't have a permit," I said, but my voice was barely above the hum of the light. One contractor knelt at the screen's edge, setting a drill bit against wood. The sound ripped through the clubhouse sharp and obscene in the confined air. Crack. A post outside my post shuddered under the bite of metal. The crack was audible, a splintering gasp of cedar giving way. I smelled it a heartbeat later, raw sawdust and resin twisting into the stale coffee stink. For an instant, I wasn't in the clubhouse. I was 16 again beside my father, the summer heat heavy on our backs, him steadying the level while I hammered the first nails. His voice, "Extra nails, son. Extra nails, keep it standing." That memory snapped in half with the sound outside. I forced myself to breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, but the air was sawdust thick. I turned to the room. "That's destruction of property. Unauthorized." Glenda raised a hand. "Correction of property." Her dog yapped from her lap as if punctuating the decree. Mark's pen rolled off the table, clattering to the floor. He bent to pick it up, but didn't raise his head again. Silence had claimed him. I pressed the ordinance copy flat against my folder. The city requires a permit. Section 14.2, Uniform Fences. Glenda cut me off with a sharp smile. The city is not in session. The board is. The drill whined again. Another chunk of cedar surrendered. The room seemed smaller by the second. Neighbors folded their arms, stared at their laps, or looked at me with something like pity. Slandered and boxed in, I felt each stare as a nail in my coffin. Maria's binder flashed briefly when she shifted in her chair. She gave the smallest shake of her head as if to remind me, not yet. "Time your reveal." The board secretary scribbled furiously, her pen scratching across paper. A coffee stain spread near the bottom of the minutes page, brown and irregular, like it might consume the words themselves. Then a manila envelope appeared in my lap. I hadn't seen who delivered it, maybe one of the assistants, maybe a courier slipping through the door. My name scrawled across in black ink. A red stamp on the corner, certified mail. I tore the flap open with hands that weren't steady. Inside a single sheet, crisp and officious. Notice of lien intent. This letter serves as notice that the Bramble Ridge HOA intends to place a lien on the property located at address in the amount of $2,400 should the non-compliant fence not be removed within 7 to 7 days of receipt of this notice. The words blurred, but the number burned. 7 days. The crack of the drill outside echoed in my skull, counting down already. I looked up. Glenda's smirk was waiting calm as porcelain. The certified envelope sat in my mailbox like a coiled snake. Red ink screamed across the top. Notice of intent to lien. I carried it back to the kitchen, the paper stiff under my fingers, the seal unbroken but already burning a hole through my chest. When I finally tore it open, the language was cold, exacting failure to remove. The fence would result in legal encumbrance collection fees and attorney costs. The words didn't matter. The number did. It was enough to choke the breath from me. I laid the letter flat on the kitchen table beside the rings of stale coffee I hadn't scrubbed off in weeks. My 401k statement glared from the edge of the table, last quarter's dip highlighted in sharp red. The line dropped like a cliff. My retirement savings were shrinking. If the lien went through and the house was tied up, everything I'd worked for 40 years of small increments would vanish. Greg knocked at the door that evening, holding 2 burgers in a paper sack. He set them down without a word, eyes scanning the letter. "She's telling folks your fence was never approved, that you made it up." I rubbed my temples. "I have the stamped letter." He shook his head, lowering his voice. "Doesn't matter. She's already swayed half the street. They're scared of fines." The HOA called an emergency vote the following week. Folding chairs again this time, more neighbors crammed into the clubhouse than I'd seen in years. The air smelled of aftershave and nervous sweat. Glenda stood at the front like a conductor ready to cue the orchestra. "Members," she began, "we have a situation of non-compliance threatening the uniformity of Bramble Ridge. We must vote whether to enforce removal and secure the lien process. A few people raised hands, quickly eager to be seen in agreement. Others looked down, folding ballots quietly. I caught Mark's eye. His gaze darted away, lips tight. He tapped his pen against the clipboard as though to drown out his conscience. When the count was read, the majority backed her. Applause rose tentative, but enough to cement the decision. I felt like the floor had tilted. The stamped approval letter in my folder was suddenly no heavier than air. 2 days later, the contractors arrived with a pickup and a saw. I heard the first groan of wood before I could reach the door. The smell of cut cedar rolled down the street like smoke. Neighbors gathered in clusters on the sidewalk, hands in pockets murmuring. No one intervened. A woman I'd waved to for years leaned against her mailbox, avoiding my glance. Another man folded his arms, nodding slightly as the panels came down. I walked to the edge of the yard. The crew yanked entire stretches of fence posts, splitting under the crowbar's bite. One section collapsed, the sound hollow and final like a tree felled in an empty forest. I pressed my palm against what remained of a corner post. The surface was jagged splinters pressing into my skin. Fresh resin filled the air, sharp and almost sweet. For a moment, I closed my eyes. I was back in 1980, holding the same wood while my father steadied the level, telling me, "Don't cut corners, Len. Wood remembers." Now it broke under strangers' hands. Glenda strolled down the sidewalk, her dog prancing at her side. She stopped just far enough to make me raise my voice if I wanted her to hear. "Uniformity will prevail," she called. Her smile was fixed, rehearsed. Neighbors shifted, unwilling to meet my eyes. I wanted to shout to wave the ordinance copy Maria had underlined for me, but the time wasn't right. My voice would scatter like sawdust. Greg stepped up beside me, muttering, "You can't hold this alone. She's got the room under her thumb." I kept my hand on the post-wood grit, biting my palm. The splinters stung, grounding me. "Then I'll wait. Paper leaves, trails." That night, I couldn't sleep. The lien letter lay on the counter, its edges curling slightly from the damp of the kitchen. I stared at it, then at the 401k sheet. Numbers bled into each other, red and relentless. Every calculation led to the same end. If the lien locked in, I would lose the house. I picked up my phone, almost dialing Maria, but stopped. Her sticky note, "Time, your reveal," floated back into memory. The quiet tick of the refrigerator was louder than my thoughts. Sometime past midnight, my phone buzzed. A message lit the screen, Mark Ellison. "There's something wrong with the HOA books. I'll show you." I read it twice, 3 times. My throat tightened. Mark the treasurer had finally cracked. The lien letter still lay open on the counter, the ink stark against the paper. My hand returned to the split in the fence post, memory of raw wood still clinging to my skin. The fracture was real, but maybe, just maybe, the numbers on the books would be worse for her than for me. The sun was brutal that afternoon, the pavement wavering in heat. A white city car eased to the curb, seal glinting. The inspector climbed out in vest and cap, clipboard snapping open with a practiced flick. Glenda swept down her driveway, pearls and leash shining. "Inspector, thank you. This property has been non-compliant for years. I've exercised emergency." He didn't smile. "Permit numbers for fence removal." Her voice faltered. "We have discretion. Board authority." He repeated, pen poised. "Permit numbers." The mower droned 2 houses down. Sweat gathered under my collar. Greg stood near the mailbox, arms folded. Mark lingered by the lamppost, pen spinning nervously in his fingers. Glenda tried again. "Emergency clause." The inspector shook his head. "City code overrides HOA bylaws." He lifted his camera, taking wide shots, torn panels stacked like bones, raw stumps jutting from concrete. He crouched, snapped the splintered base of a post, resin glistening. Mark cleared his throat. "Inspector, payments to the contractor came from HOA reserves, coded as sidewalk work." It wasn't. His eyes stayed down. "Invoices point to her address." Glenda stiffened. "Mark." The inspector noted it without comment. "So no permit was obtained." She said nothing. The mower sputtered and stopped. For a moment the street was silent but for the shutter clicks. Neighbors leaned on porches, phones raised discreetly. My hand rested on the jagged post, rough wood hot against my palm. The inspector turned a page. His voice was steady as he read citation issued for removal of residential fence without permit, violation of Municipal Code FAR 14.2. Glenda's face drained. The sticker with fine. $10,000 went on the form in his neat block letters. He passed the yellow copy to her. Instructions for appeal are on page 2. City law applies regardless of board action. Her lips moved no words. The little dog tugged at the leash, whining. He asked me for documentation. I handed the folder Maria had trained me to keep dated photos approval letter, certified lien notice. He flipped, nodded once. This will be added to the case, neighbors murmured. A couple across the street filmed openly now. Greg gave a quiet snort, not quite laughter. Mark rubbed his temple like the guilt was physical. The inspector shut the clipboard with a hard snap, then walked back to his car. The door shut engine starting with a hum. He didn't look back. Glenda stood frozen citation trembling in her hand. She finally turned climbing her driveway as though the air had thickened. The pearls looked heavier than stone. That evening, my phone chimed. Then another. Subject lines stacked state compliance case opened Bramble Ridge, HOA. Screens glowed up and down the street. Driveways lit like lanterns in the dark. For the first time in years, the night belonged to more than her. The clubhouse smelled of burnt coffee and sweat. Folding chairs screeched against the linoleum as neighbors shifted whispering in jagged bursts. An emergency meeting called less than a week after the inspector's citation had everyone restless. I sat near the back, palms damp the memory of that yellow citation still etched in my mind. Greg leaned forward in the seat beside me. Tonight, he muttered, she won't walk out the same. The door opened. Maria entered with a folder hugged to her chest, her gray coat draped neatly across one arm. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She nodded once to me. It's time, she said quietly, sliding into a chair near the front. Glenda was already at the podium, pearls gleaming defiantly, the little dog left at home for once. She tapped the microphone, plastering on her boardroom smile. This meeting is to address rumors circulating about financial impropriety. I assure you they are unfounded. Maria rose before Glenda could go further. Point of order. Her voice carried steadier than I remembered. The so-called emergency correction clause you invoked. It doesn't exist. Not in Bramble Ridge's bylaws, not in any amendment filed with the county. A rustle moved through the crowd. Papers flipped. Someone coughed sharply. Glenda blinked, mouth opening, then shutting again. Maria laid her folder flat on the table, her finger tapping the header page. I have copies of the bylaws from 2014 through 2021 certified. No emergency clause. Your claim was fabricated. Glenda tried to wave her off. That's interpretation. Mark stood, then eyes downcast but voice firm. And the money, Glenda. Invoices marked sidewalk resurfacing. But the checks went to a landscaping company. For your yard. Sod irrigation retaining wall. Paid out of reserve funds. The room exploded, chairs scraping back, voices overlapping. She stole from us. I paid those assessments. You lied. My throat tightened. For years, neighbors had looked away, fearful of her tone. Now their words came sharp, rising like a tide. Glenda slammed the podium with her palm. This is slander. Maria didn't flinch. It's documentation. She slid copies across the table. The treasurer's signature, the contractor's invoice, county bank stamp, and it will stand in court. A vote was called, hastily scribbled ballots collected in a shoebox. The murmur died as Mark tallied sweat beading on his forehead. He cleared his throat. Motion passes. Effective immediately. Glenda Lancaster is removed as HOA president. For a heartbeat, silence. Then cheers broke raw and uneven, but real. The clubhouse shook with applause, hands slapping tables. Through the open window, the sharp thunk, thunk of hammers echoed. Neighbors had already begun lifting posts in my yard, pressing them back into the earth. The smell of cut pine drifted in fresh and green. My chest loosened for the first time in years. Glenda sagged against the podium, pearls dull under the fluorescence. She reached for her papers, but the door opened again. A uniformed sheriff's deputy stepped in, expression flat. He held a white envelope out, voice firm. Ms. Lancaster summons from the district attorney's office. The room froze. Cameras rose. A neighbor gasped audibly. Glenda's hand shook as she took the paper. For once, she had no words. I sat back, the sound of hammers outside mingling with the swell of voices inside. Balance, not revenge, had finally found its way into Bramble Ridge. The judge's voice carried across the courtroom like a gavel without needing to strike. Guilty of misusing funds. Barred from HOA office. Restitution ordered. The room was silent but alive with small sounds, papers shuffling, a cough, a chair creaking. Glenda stared at the table. For years she had filled rooms with her voice. Now she had none. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Justice didn't roar. It settled firm as a fence post in the fresh concrete. By summer 2024, the fence stood whole again. New cedar boards lined up bright against the older wood. At the corner post, a bronze plaque gleamed, restored by neighbors protected by law. Greg read it aloud, smiling. The scent of barbecue drifted from my grill, mixing with the cedar. Neighbors gathered, bringing plates and stories. For the first time in years, no one whispered about fines. Children drew chalk suns on the driveway. Their laughter outlasted the cicadas. Maria arrived with cornbread in one hand, a folder in the other. She set the pan on the table and the folder beside it, then nudged the folder aside with a laugh. "No bylaws tonight, just food." Mark flipped ribs at the grill smoke curling around his shoulders. He leaned over and said, "Quarterly audits start next month. Meeting minutes will be online, no more secret clauses." I nodded. That's the kind of permanence I like. The board had rewritten the rules. Every change required open notice and a community vote. I'd helped word the section that ended the so-called emergency authority. Not poetry, but it carried more weight than any speech. Neighbors passed lemonade and apologies, some for silence, others for hesitation. I took each in stride. We'd all been under Glenda's spell at some point. The important part was how it ended. As dusk came, kids chased fireflies through the yard. Their glow blinked between fence slats like tiny lanterns. People laughed, easy and unforced. The fence wasn't just wood again. It was proof that we had weathered something together. Then a car rolled past slowly. Glenda. Both hands tight on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the plaque. She didn't wave, no one jeered. She drove on, leaving only exhaust that disappeared in the warm air. The silence after she turned the corner was louder than any verdict. Maria touched the plaque and said softly, "You timed it right?" "You taught me to wait," I answered. We both smiled. The fence line didn't hide the scar where old met new. We left it visible, a reminder. Healing doesn't erase, it shows where the break was and where people chose to mend it. Later, as the grill hissed low and stars came out, I walked the fence one last time. I pressed my hand against the rail. It was warm, steady. "Peace at last," I whispered. The fence held, and so did we. The clubhouse doors finally stayed open, and the smell of barbecue drifted over the new fence, its plaque shining where neighbors' hands had fastened it. Children's laughter carried across the yard, the cedar rails warm beneath my palm, no longer a line of division, but a bond. Justice isn't loud. It's steady, stitched together by patient neighbors and a few stubborn facts. We learned that even the stiffest bylaw bends when a community stands shoulder to shoulder, choosing care over fear. If your street has ever felt smothered by paper and fines, remember neighbors can be louder than any clause. Where has your town found its voice lately?